The coal came early to Millhaven that year. It arrived before the calendar gave it permission, settling over the northern Montana flatlands like something that had been waiting just beyond the tree line, patient, certain, inevitable. By the third week of October, the fields had already turned the color of old iron. The dirt roads held frost in their ruts until past noon. The sky stayed low and pale, the kind of sky that didn't threaten storms so much as remind you that warmth had always been temporary. Marin Cole drove into that cold the way she drove into most things, without announcement, without expectation, and without any particular belief that the day would ask anything meaningful of her. She was 37 years old. She had short, dark hair, kept practical, and gray-green eyes that moved the way trained eyes always did not, with suspicion exactly, but with a kind of constant involuntary inventory. Her face was lean, angular, weathered just enough to suggest that whatever softness had once lived there had been replaced by something quieter and more durable. She stood 5'8", carried herself straight without stiffness, and had the economical build of someone whose body had been used as a working tool for most of her adult life. She had spent 9 years as a special agent with the Army Criminal Investigation Division. She had worked fraud cases, contract violations, assault cases, and forward operating bases in places where the wind tasted like chalk and gunpowder. She had learned to read a room before entering it, to notice the thing a person didn't say more than the thing they did, to hold her conclusions loosely and her observations tightly. Then came the incident in her final deployment. She didn't call it a breakdown. The Army called it a medical separation. The distinction mattered to her, though she had stopped explaining why. She had been living outside Millhaven for 14 months, a small house on a low rise near an aging white church that no longer held regular services. Modest, functional. A back fence that needed repair. A truck that had once been forest green and was now simply the color of years. She kept the house clean and the yard clear, and spoke to her neighbors when spoken to, which was not often, because the neighbors understood that some people chose this particular corner of Montana precisely because it did not ask too many questions. She had come to the weekend market for 3 things: weatherproof sealant for the porch boards, a replacement hinge for the back gate, and 2 50-pound bags of winter feed for the 3 chickens she kept in a side enclosure, which she had not named and did not intend to name, because naming things created obligations she was still deciding whether she wanted. The market spread across a gravel lot at the edge of town, just past where the county road bent north toward the timber leases. It appeared on the first and third Saturday of each month, fold-out tables, wire shelving, plastic tarps strung between poles against the wind. Generators hummed. Coffee steamed in paper cups. People moved through it with the particular purposefulness of rural commerce, buying what could not wait and leaving what could. Marin moved through it the same way she moved through everything, efficiently, without excess. She found the sealant, she found the hinge. She was considering the feed supplier's table when she saw the sign. It was written in black marker on a piece of corrugated cardboard tied with orange baling twine to the wire panels of a low makeshift pen. The letters were uneven, slanted downward toward the right, as if the person writing them had started with more care than they finished. Mother dog plus pups, clearance price. Marin stopped. Not because the words were shocking. The words were the problem. Clearance price. Not needs good home. Not must go to caring family. Not even for sale in any recognizable human sense of the phrase. Clearance price. The language of a warehouse. The language of inventory that had failed to move. Inside the pen stood a German shepherd and 3 puppies. The mother was black and tan, though you had to look twice to see the richness that those colors were supposed to carry, because neglect had dulled everything. She was about 5 years old, possibly older, and thin, in a way that spoke less of starvation and more of prolonged depletion. The kind of thin that came from giving more than a body was built to sustain over too many years. Her hip bones showed. Her ribs did not protrude sharply, but implied themselves beneath the coat. Her belly was loose and low. Her eyes were amber. Deep, warm amber, the color of old honey, held up to light. But the light in them had receded. Not gone. Receded. The way a fire recedes in the early hours of morning, still present, still capable, but burning low on whatever had once fed it. The 3 puppies pressed close against her legs. One was bolder than the others, pawing weakly at the wire ears, still uncertain about their final position. One stayed tucked into the mother's side, small and still. The third, the smallest, leaned into the warmth of the mother's foreleg with the complete trusting weight of a creature that had not yet learned to doubt. Two men stood near the pen, examining one of the puppies with a detached appraisal of people assessing secondhand equipment. A woman in rubber boots leaned over and said the mother looked used up. Someone else lifted the smallest puppy by the scruff, frowned at something invisible, and set it back down. The mother shifted immediately, placing her body between the hands and the other puppies. She didn't bark. She didn't snarl. She moved with a tired, deliberate certainty, the way someone moves when they have performed this particular act of protection so many times it has become indistinguishable from breathing. Marin felt something tighten behind her sternum. She had seen cruelty in loud forms. She had documented it, photographed it, written it into case reports with precise clinical language. She had also seen the quieter kind, the kind that happened not with malice but with indifference, the kind that wore the face of transaction. This was the quieter kind. The man standing beside the pen with a styrofoam cup and an expression of permanent mild impatience was Horrick Briggs. He was in his late 40s, thick through the middle, with a reddened face and eyes that moved over people the way a hardware store clerk moved over inventory quickly, functionally without real interest. He had the look of a man who had made his living moving things from one place to another and had never spent much time asking what those things wanted. He noticed Marin looking. "You buying or browsing?" he asked. Marin looked at the sign, then at the DAW, then back at Briggs. "How much?" she said, not a question, a data request. He named a number that was less a price than a disposal fee, the kind of sum that said the transaction wasn't really about money. Marin reached for her wallet. Briggs blinked. "All of them. All of them." He took the bills with a particular expression she cataloged without commenting on the expression of a man recalculating. Not surprise, not gratitude, recalculation. The look of someone who had just realized a thing had sold faster than expected and was now wondering whether he had understood its value correctly. Marin crouched at the pen and opened the latch. The mother stepped back one half step. No more. The puppies bunched beneath her. Up close, Marin could see the faint thinning of fur at the dog's neck, the shadow of prolonged pressure, the ghost of something that had been there a long time. She could also see that the dog was not simply afraid of her. She carried a broader fear, the kind that had learned to expect nothing from anyone and had structured itself accordingly. "It's all right," Marin said. She heard the inadequacy of it the moment it left her mouth. She kept her movements slow. Shoulder turned, no direct reach. She lined a wooden crate with an old blanket from the truck bed and began lifting the puppies one at a time. The bold one wriggled. The tucked one gave a thin sound that was not quite a cremo. The smallest, the one that had been leaning into its mother's foreleg, trembled against her palm. Too light. Bones too close to the surface. The mother watched every movement with a focus so complete it felt like a physical presence. Then Marin reached toward the smallest puppy a second time, and the mother stepped forward. She didn't lunge. She didn't show teeth. She placed herself between Marin's hand and the puppy and stood on her thin legs looking straight at Marin with those low, burning amber eyes, and the expression in them was not aggression and not pleading and not submission. It was examination. It was the look of a creature that had arrived at the final and most important question: what kind of person is this, and what will they do next? Marin had seen that look before, though not in a dog. She had seen it in interview rooms, in the faces of people who had been failed so many times that hope itself had become a liability, and who were nonetheless, despite everything, offering one more moment of assessment, one more chance to be wrong about what the world was. She held the gaze, didn't push through, didn't force, just waited. After 3 long seconds, the mother stepped aside. Marin lifted the last puppy. She stood turned toward the truck. Behind her, she heard it, the soft, careful sound of paws on frost-hardened gravel. She didn't look back. She was loading the crate into the back seat when the woman from the coffee table appeared beside her, small-framed, bundled in a dark quilted jacket, wind-reddened cheeks, eyes that were kind, in the precise, guarded way of someone who had learned when kindness needed to stay quiet. She leaned slightly forward and kept her voice low. "You should leave quickly." Marin looked at her. "You know." The woman pressed her lips together. Her eyes moved once toward Briggs, then past him toward the far end of the lot. Because some things here get sold twice. The sentence arrived softly. Marin let it settle without showing that it had. She looked toward the far end of the gravel lot. At the edge of the market, half hidden behind a row of parked vehicles, sat a pickup. Older model, dark finish. The engine was running. She could see the faint exhaust rising in the cold air. The windshield caught the flat winter light and held it, hiding whoever was behind it. But the truck was parked facing the road, and it had been there since before she arrived. Marin closed the back door without hurrying. She walked around to the driver's side at the same pace she had walked through the entire market. She started the engine. She pulled out. In the mirror, the dark truck pulled out 30 seconds later. She did not take the main route home. There was a county road she knew from her first months in Millhaven before she had stopped exploring and simply begun existing. It cut north through a stand of lodgepole pine, narrowed to one lane at the creek crossing, and then wound up a long ridge before dropping back to the flatlands east of her property. It was the kind of road that rewarded familiarity and punished hesitation. She drove it with the ease of someone who had spent years navigating unfamiliar terrain by learning one narrow path at a time. She kept her speed deliberate, not fast enough to suggest flight, not slow enough to invite approach. At the creek crossing, she took the fork that wasn't marked. The dark truck appeared at the main junction, slowed, then continued straight. Marin exhaled once very slowly. Then she drove the rest of the way home. The house sat on its low rise in the thin afternoon light, the old church visible through the bare maple trees. To the east, the fields rolling pale and flat in every other direction. She parked, sat for a moment without moving. From the back seat came small sounds, a shift of weight, a thin, uncertain whine, the soft compression of bodies settling. She opened the back door. The mother dog jumped down before she was invited. Her paws hit the frozen ground, and she stood still, scanning everything. The porch, the shed, the fence line, the open sky. Her body was taut reading cataloging. Not wild, methodical. Marin watched her. "You're doing threat assessment," she said quietly. The dog's ear flicked once. Marin carried the crate inside. She heard the careful sound of paws following across the frozen ground. Not because there was trust, because there was nowhere else to go that seemed better. She worked through the afternoon the way she worked through everything, without wasted motion. She boiled water and let it cool to the right temperature. She cut the dry food into smaller portions and mixed it with warm broth from a can she found at the back of the cabinet. She set the crate near the south-facing wall where the afternoon light would reach in a few hours. She laid out clean towels. The mother dog moved through the house slowly, methodically. She checked each corner. She noted each exit. She positioned herself between the crate and the room before she would accept anything. The bold puppy had already decided the blanket was a wrestling opponent. The tucked one watched from the center of the crate with enormous calculating eyes. The smallest, the one that had trembled against Marin's palm, sat near the edge and looked at the room as if it was trying to determine whether the concept of inside was something it could trust. Marin knelt slowly. She lifted the smallest puppy with both hands, supporting its full weight. It trembled, then went still. She ran her thumb along its ribs, counting. Too prominent. Not dangerous, not yet, but a record of deprivation. "Hey," she said. Nothing. Just the small, warm weight of uncertainty in her hands. She set it down gently. It looked up at her, then with a kind of slow, surprised deliberateness, it leaned forward and rested its chin against her knee. Marin didn't move. The knock came just after 5 o'clock. Walter Finch stood on the porch in a wool-lined canvas jacket and work boots that had seen 30 years of Montana winters. He was 72, lean in the way of men who had worked their bodies steadily their entire lives, with a face that had been weathered into something deeply lined and quietly attentive. His white hair was short, his posture upright without effort. He carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, leftover cornbread, from that morning it turned out, and his eyes, when they found the dog, went still in a particular way. Not sentimental, recognizing. He stepped inside when she moved aside. He looked at the mother dog for a long moment, and the mother dog looked back at him with the same measuring amber gaze she had given everyone else, except that something in it shifted slightly. Not trust, an absence of immediate rejection. "That one," Walter said quietly, "has been told what she is so many times she started to believe it." Marin didn't answer. She handed him a cup of coffee, and he sat in the chair near the window, and they spent the next hour in the kind of silence that didn't require filling. Walter drank his coffee. The bold puppy tried to climb the side of the crate and fell backward. Walter watched it without comment. When he left, he said only, "Lock the back gate tonight." Marin locked the back gate. She also checked the truck. She had been moving toward this since the market, she realized, not urgently, but with the slow accumulation of detail that her years in CID had made automatic. The dark truck waiting. Briggs's expression when she paid. The coffee woman's warning. The way the price had been wrong, not because it was too low for a dog, but because it suggested the dogs were not what was actually being transacted. She walked to the truck with a flashlight and ran the beam along the bed. Clean, both sides. Then she reached the rear right panel, just above where the crate had rested, and the beam caught something. A thin line. A scratch. Except it wasn't a scratch. She ran her thumb across it. The surface was different, textured, slightly differently from the paint around it, as if something had been applied over an existing mark. She pressed harder. The overlay was thin, fragile. Beneath it, carved directly into the metal in narrow, deliberate strokes, was a number. Not long, not complex, just a sequence. The kind of sequence that functioned as a reference code. The kind that meant something to a system, even if it meant nothing to her yet. She stood in the cold for a long moment, the flashlight held steady. This was not vandalism. Vandals worked fast and left obvious marks. This was deliberate, or careful, the work of someone who expected the truck to move again, to carry something specific to a specific destination, and wanted that movement tracked. They weren't following the truck. They were following what was inside it. She went back inside. She didn't sleep much. The smallest puppy she had begun without deciding to think of it as Wren had stopped trembling sometime in the night and was now sleeping with its belly pressed against the blanket in the slow, even rhythm of a creature that had perhaps for the first time decided the ground beneath it might hold. Marin sat in the chair by the window and watched the road. In the morning, she drove back to the market. The lot was empty, not cleared, not closing. Empty in the way of something that had never intended to stay. The tarps were gone, the tables were gone. The generator, the folding shelves, the handwritten signs, the tire ruts from the vehicles, all of it, as if the market had been a temporary agreement between commerce and geography that had simply decided to lapse. A few scuff marks in the gravel. A torn piece of orange baling twine near where the pen had been. She crouched and picked up the twine, turned it over in her fingers. "You're late." The voice came from the fence line at the edge of the field. An older man leaned against a post with his arms crossed, watching her with the patient, economical attention of someone who had been standing in that exact position for a long time. He was in his late 60s, thin but not frail, with a white beard trimmed by habit rather than care, and eyes that were sharp in a way that it suggested he had spent many years being underestimated. Vernon Moss. She had seen him before at the edges of things, at the margins of town events, at the fence lines between other people's conversations. She had never spoken to him directly. "Market moved this fast?" she asked. He shrugged, a slow, deliberate movement. "That one does." "Why?" "Because it doesn't belong here," he said. "It belongs to money. Sets up where it's easy. Tears down before it gets questioned." Marin straightened. "Who runs it?" Vernon gave a short, dry sound that was almost a laugh. "Men who don't enjoy being asked that." She waited. He looked at her for a moment, then looked out across the field. "What you bought yesterday," he said. "The mother dog." "What about her?" "She wasn't being sold." He said it the way you said a thing you had been waiting to say to the right person. "Not really. The man running that pen, Briggs, he's not an owner. He's a carrier. A middle step." He paused. "The dog was supposed to be delivered somewhere specific. Briggs had her too long, needed the space, thought he could run a quiet transaction and replace her before anyone noticed." "Replace her with what?" "Another dog, same breed, close enough to pass inspection." Vernon turned to look at her directly. "Except that particular dog isn't replaceable. That's the problem you have walked into." Marin kept her voice even. "Who is she being delivered to?" Vernon's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, a tightening, a careful calibration, the look of a man deciding how far into a thing he was willing to step. "A man named Vane," he said finally. "Conrad Vane. He doesn't live here. He doesn't live anywhere you'd easily find him. But he owns things in a lot of places, and one of the things he owns is a network. He paused again. Your dog was the centerpiece of a long-term arrangement. She wasn't delayed inventory. She was a priority allocation that went sideways. And the man who was supposed to receive her knows exactly where she is. The cold pressed in from the open field. Marin stood in it without flinching. Briggs didn't have the authority to sell her, Vernon continued, which means the transaction you made yesterday in the eyes of the people who consider themselves her owners was not a sale. He looked at her steadily. You understand what I'm saying. She understood. You took something that someone with considerable resources considers to be their property, he said, and they have known where it is since the moment it left that lot. She thought of the mark on her truck, the careful, deliberate carving beneath the thin layer of paint, the dark truck waiting at the edge of the market with its engine running. She thought of the amber eyes in the pen burning low, still burning. How long have you known about this? She asked. Vernon was quiet for a moment. Long enough that I'm telling you now, he said, instead of before. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't quite an explanation. It was the honest answer of a man who had watched a thing develop from a careful distance and had finally decided that the person standing in front of him was worth the risk of saying something true. She drove back to the house. Sage was standing at the window when she arrived. Not frantic, not pacing, standing. Watching the road with those amber eyes that were, Marin thought, not quite as dim as they had been the day before. Wren was asleep in the center of the blanket belly, rising and falling in slow, certain breaths. Marin stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the room, at the small evidence of life beginning to redistribute itself through the space. The empty water bowl that needed refilling. The bold puppy chewing thoughtfully on a corner of the blanket. The third puppy, she had begun to think of it as Ash, sitting near the wall, with its head tilted to one side, watching the room with the patient observational quality of a creature that was learning things and filing them away. She looked at Sage. Sage looked back. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then the dog turned her head back toward the window, and Marin stepped inside and closed the door. And the house held them both in the particular quiet of two beings who had found themselves in the same uncertain place and had not yet decided whether that was accident or something else. She refilled the water bowl. She checked the back gate. She sat at the table with Odin and wrote down the sequence she had memorized from the metal panel of her truck, the number that had been placed there deliberately by someone who expected it to lead them somewhere. Then she wrote one word beneath it: vain. Outside, the wind moved across the frozen fields and pressed against the windows and moved on the way wind always did, without interest in what it passed, without memory of where it had been, without any awareness at all of what had just begun. 3 days passed before Marin stopped checking the road every hour, not because the feeling had left her, because she had decided that constant vigilance without actionable intelligence was just anxiety wearing a tactical vest, and she had no patience for that. She had spent 9 years in CID learning the difference between productive alertness and the kind of watching that consumed more than it protected. So she folded the road checking down to twice daily, morning and last light, and spent the hours in between doing what needed doing. What needed doing was considerable. Sage had not relaxed exactly, but she had redistributed. She no longer stood at the window through the full morning. She had begun to move through the house with a different quality of attention, still scanning, still noting, but with the pace of an animal conducting a survey rather than bracing for impact. She ate without first nudging the bowl toward the puppies, which Marin noted without comment. She allowed Marin to move within 3 feet of her without shifting her weight. Small distances, real ones. Wren had stopped trembling entirely. This seemed to Marin like the most significant development of the 3 days, though she couldn't have explained precisely why. There was something about the smallest and most fragile creature in a space deciding that the ground was trustworthy, that functioned in her experience as the most honest, available measurement of whether a place was actually safe. She was watching Wren attempt to navigate the 3-inch drop from the blanket to the floor, treating it with the full seriousness of a mountaineering expedition, when her phone rang. It was Walter. "There's a man at the gas station on Route 9, he said without preamble. "Been there since yesterday. Sits in the lot, buys coffee, doesn't go anywhere. I've seen the truck before." "Before when?" "Before you came back from the market Saturday." Marin set the phone down after the call and sat for a moment at the kitchen table. Then she put on her jacket, told Sage unnecessarily, and aware of the unnecessariness that she would be back, and drove toward Route 9 by the long way. She parked a quarter mile from the wine station and walked the rest. The truck was there. Not the same dark pickup from the market, this one was newer, a muted charcoal gray Montana plates she memorized in 2 seconds. A man sat behind the wheel with a coffee cup and the specific practiced stillnesses of someone doing what surveillance people did when they wanted to look like they were doing nothing. She clocked him for 4 minutes from behind the tree line. Then she drove to the service road behind the old Kellerman processing plant, which had been closed for 11 years and which she had walked twice in her first month in Millhaven, out of a habit of knowing the geography around her. She sat in the truck and thought. The man at the gas station was not Conrad Vane. He was functional a watcher, a relay point, someone paid to confirm location and report it upstream. That was useful information. It told her that Vane was not acting precipitously. He was patient. He was measuring. He believed he had time, which meant he believed the situation was still manageable on his terms. She needed to understand why Sage was worth this level of management. Harwick Briggs had vanished with the market. Vernon Moss had given her Vane's name and nothing else. She needed another entry point, and she needed it before Vane decided that measuring was finished and something else should begin. She found Lucas Trent the next morning. She had not been looking for Lucas Trent specifically. She had been looking for anyone connected to the network of casual, deniable logistics that systems like the one Vernon had described always required the drivers, the carriers, the people who moved things without asking what the things were for. She had spent the morning driving the county's secondary routes, noting which vehicles appeared at multiple locations in patterns that suggested purpose rather than coincidence. The truck she followed to the Route 12 filling station was a white 3/4 ton with a covered bed and out-of-county plates. The man who climbed out was in his early 30s, broad-shouldered with a face that carried a kind of compressed exhaustion. Not tired from last night, tired from the last several years. His jacket was heavy canvas worn at the cuffs. His boots had the look of tools that had seen too much pavement. She went inside and bought 2 coffees. When she came back out, she handed him one. He looked at her with the wariness of someone who had learned that unexpected kindness usually meant something was about to be requested. "I don't know you," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you know the market that ran off Consolidated Road last Saturday?" A beat. The compression in his face deepened. He looked at the coffee cup, then out at the road, then at nothing particular. The specific pattern of a man deciding how long a silence he could reasonably maintain. "I don't run that circuit anymore," he said finally. "I know. You look like someone who made a decision." He looked at her directly for the first time. Something shifted slightly in the exhaustion. "What do you want?" "I want to understand what I took," she said. "The mother dog. I bought her Saturday. I need to know why that matters to the people it matters to." Lucas Trent was quiet for a long time. Then he drank the coffee she had given him and looked at the tree line across the road, and he said with the careful economy of a man who had been holding something uncomfortable for a while, "She's not just a breeding dog." Marin waited. The organization, the people who run these circuits, they've spent years developing specific genetic lines. Not randomly, deliberately. Particular temperament profiles, particular physical characteristics, health histories going back 3 or 4 generations. He paused. "The dog you took, the black and tan female, her line is almost gone. There are maybe 2 or 3 animals in the country with her specific lineage. Vane has been working toward acquiring the last of them for a long time, not for resale, for exclusive propagation. He controls the line, he controls the supply, he controls everything downstream." Briggs sold her without authorization. Briggs needed money and thought he could replace her before the transfer date. He couldn't. Lucas turned the cup in his hands. "Vane doesn't lose things, not things he's invested in, not things that are part of something larger." "How large?" "Large enough that one woman in a house outside Millhaven doesn't register as a complication that can't be managed." He said it without cruelty, just as a statement of proportion. "You need to understand what you're standing next to." She understood. She had understood since the mark on the truck. She thanked him and walked back to her vehicle, and she sat in it for a few minutes with her hands resting on the wheel. Then she drove to the address Vernon had given her. The building sat at the end of a dirt access road 3 miles east of the county line, where the land flattened and the tree cover thinned, and there was nothing around it that would attract attention in either direction. From the road, it looked like any one of a dozen industrial outbuildings she had passed in her 14 months in Millhaven: gray siding, oxidized to the color of old dishwater, a sagging roofline chain-link fencing that leaned slightly as if it had been tired for years. She did not take Sage the first time. She drove out alone, walked the perimeter, noted the sight lines, confirmed what she had already suspected from the approach, that this building had not been abandoned. Abandonment had a specific appearance. Things softened, vegetation encroached. The process of time made itself visible. This building had been emptied. There was a distinction, and she knew exactly what it looked like. She went back the next morning with Sage. She had not planned to take her. She had backed the truck to the gate, and Sage had been there, not frantic, not demanding, just present, standing beside the tailgate with an expression that communicated with the quiet certainty of an animal that had run out of patience for being underestimated, that she was coming. Marin had opened the door. The moment Sage's paws touched the ground at the access road, the dog changed. It was not fear. Fear in Sage looked a specific way Marin had studied it for days. This was different. The head lowered. The weight shifted forward. Every muscle in the dog's frame moved into a different relationship with the ground, as if her body had found a posture it had been trained into so deeply that proximity to this place had recalled it without permission. A posture that was older than the last 3 days. Older than Marin. Something written into the dog by repetition until it had become automatic. Memory, Marin thought. Not fear, memory. The thing that fear left behind when the threat was no longer immediate, but the body hadn't been told it was allowed to forget. Sage walked forward without being directed. Marin followed. The door was unlocked. It moved on its hinges with the ease of something that had been opened and closed many times recently, the mechanism still clean, still functional. Inside, the light came through high, narrow windows and fell in pale rectangles across a concrete floor. The air carried the sharp, controlled scent of chemical cleanser, not the organic smell of a place that had been left. The antiseptic smell of a place that had been scrubbed. Wire cages lined the east wall. Empty. The doors hung open at identical angles. A long metal table along the north wall showed the parallel scoring of things dragged across it repeatedly, not randomly, systematically at regular intervals. A clipboard lay on the floor near the far wall, pages torn out cleanly, not in haste but in procedure, the way you removed records when removal was part of the protocol. This was not cruelty for its own sake, Marin thought. She had seen that too in her years of investigation. This was something colder. A system that did not hate, did not rage, did not feel anything at all. A system that measured, allocated, and removed what did not perform. The indifference of pure function. Sage had moved ahead without pausing at the cages or the table. She passed through the space with the direct, purposeful movement of a dog that was not exploring but returning. At the far wall in the furthest corner, where the light reached last, she stopped. There, half in shadow, was another dog. A German Shepherd female. Older than Sage by visible measure, though the age was less in years than in damage, the kind of age that came from having the margins of a life narrowed progressively until movement itself required permission. Her coat was patchy along the spine and rib cage. Her frame was thin past the point of depletion into something that looked structural, as if there was not enough left to deplete. Her eyes were open and tracking but distant in the particular way that Marin associated with people who had been in certain situations too long, not absent but detached, as if the self had retreated to a safe interior distance from which the world could be observed without being felt. 2 puppies lay beside her, smaller than Wren, thinner. Marin crouched. "Hey," she said, voice low. No response. The dog did not flinch, did not retreat. She accepted Marin's presence the way a person accepted weather as a fact with no available response. Sage lowered herself carefully and lay down beside the older dog, not offering comfort in any theatrical sense, not asserting anything, just making contact, shoulder to shoulder in the half-light, the way 2 people sit in a waiting room when they understand without speaking that they are there for the same reason. The older dog's body twitched, one small movement. Then she pressed barely perceptibly back. Marin exhaled. She stood and walked the perimeter of the building, reading it the way she had been trained to read spaces, not for what was there, but for what the arrangement of what was there implied about how it had been used. The drag marks on the table were consistent with regular repeated movement of objects of similar weight and dimension. The hook array on the back wall, she found it behind a shelving unit, held frayed strands of nylon cord. Restraints, the kind designed for compliance, not for care. The spacing of the hooks suggested systematic routine use, not isolated incident. She was documenting the hooks in her memory when she heard the vehicle. It came up the access road at a measured pace, neither hurrying nor idling. A single vehicle, well maintained, she could tell from the engine tone before it stopped. She stepped outside. The man who got out of the dark-paneled SUV was in his early 40s, and he had the particular quality of people who had cultivated invisibility as a professional asset. Not short, not tall, not loud, not silent. A charcoal jacket that fit without excess, dark trousers with no visible wear, boots that had been used without being abused, dark hair neatly kept, a clean-shaven face with high cheekbones and a jaw that held it set without apparent effort. His eyes were gray-brown and practiced. They moved across the scene in the same way Marin's did, except that where hers cataloged for comprehension, his cataloged for control. Conrad Vane. She knew it before he spoke. He stopped at a comfortable distance, not threatening, not retreating. He assessed the situation with the unhurried calm of a man who was accustomed to assessing situations from a position of structural advantage. Then his gaze found Sage. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise, not warmth, recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has located a valuable asset they had begun to consider lost. It was, Marin thought, the most honest emotion he had shown in the 30 seconds she had been watching him, and it told her more about him than anything he would say. "Ms. Cole," he said, a confirmation, not a greeting. "Vane," she said. He took that without reaction. "You've had a chance to look around," he said, gesturing with a slight motion toward the building. "I hope it's provided some context." "It has." "Then you understand that what occurred at the market on Saturday was an unauthorized deviation from a scheduled process. Not a sale, not a legal transfer of ownership." He said it with the reasonable tone of someone explaining a procedural matter. "The animal you have in your possession was not available for purchase. She was in a pen with a price on her, by a man who had no authority to place her there." He paused. "I don't imagine you're unfamiliar with the distinction between apparent authority and actual authority, given your background." He knew her background. Of course he did. She filed that without expression. "The dog is at my house," Marin said. "With her puppies. She's staying there." Vane tilted his head a fraction. The motion of a man who was recalibrating, not responding. "I'm not here to argue," he said. "I'm here to explain the situation clearly so that you can make an informed decision." He paused. "She represents the last viable instance of a genetic line I have spent considerable time and resources developing. She is not interchangeable. She cannot be replaced. What she carries is irreproducible without her." He let that sit. "I will compensate you for any inconvenience. Substantially. She's not for sale." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger, closer to the expression of a man encountering a variable he had not weighted appropriately. "You misunderstand your position," he said. "I understand it clearly," Marin said. "You have resources and patience and a system designed to outlast individual resistance. I understand exactly what I'm standing next to." She looked at him steadily. "The dog is staying with me." Vane held her gaze for a moment. Then he straightened his jacket in a small, precise gesture and turned back toward his vehicle. He opened the door. He paused. "What leaves our system," he said without looking back, "doesn't stay unaccounted for." He got in. The engine started. The vehicle moved back down the access road at the same measured pace it had arrived. Marin stood in the cold until it was out of sight. Then she went back inside and began wrapping the two remaining puppies in the extra blanket she had brought from the truck bed, and she lifted the older dog, lighter than anything living should be, and carried her outside, and Sage followed without being asked. She drove back to the house with more than she had come with. She called them Nova, and kept the two new puppies unnamed for the moment because they were too fragile for certainty. Nova lay in the second space Marin built against the south wall, not separate from Sage's area, not merged with it, just adjacent. Sage moved to the edge of her own space and lay facing Nova across the 6-inch gap between them. They stayed like that for most of the afternoon. That evening, Walter came again. He sat in his chair and looked at the expanded population of the room with the expression of a man who had suspected this was coming. He didn't say anything about the new arrivals for a while. He drank his coffee. He watched Ren attempt to engage Nova's puppies through the low barrier Marin had built, pressing its nose through the gap with the hopeful persistence of a creature that had recently discovered that the world contained other creatures. Vane came himself, Walter said finally. It was not a question. Yes. That means he's decided it's worth his personal attention. Walter turned his cup in his hands. That's not a comfortable development. No. What did he say? She told him. Walter listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to value about him, that he understood silence as participation rather than absence. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he'll try something indirect next. People like that don't move in straight lines when straight lines carry risk. They find the thing you care most about that you haven't protected yet. Marin looked at the room, at Ren asleep against Sage's side, at the thin, even breathing of Nova's puppies. I know, she said. She reinforced the gate that night with an additional crossbar. She checked the perimeter of the fence and filled the gap at the southwest corner she'd been meaning to repair for 2 weeks. She brought the chickens inside for the night, which they objected to, and moved Sage's crate against the inner wall where it wasn't visible from the windows. She was as careful as she knew how to be. It wasn't careful enough. She woke at 3 in the morning to the specific quality of silence that meant something had changed. Not a sound that woke her, the absence of one. The small ambient nighttime sounds of the room, the shift of weight, the soft respiration of 6 animals had a gap in them. She was on her feet before she had finished the thought. She counted. Sage, Ash, Flint, Nova, Nova's 2. She counted again. No Ren. She moved through the house in 10 seconds. Back door still locked. Front door still locked. She went to the window and turned on the exterior light. The back fence. She could see from here. The southwest corner. The gap she had filled. It had been reopened, not torn, not broken, but moved. Carefully, precisely by hands that knew what they were doing. And caught on the edge of the wire fluttering in the night air was a small piece of dark fabric. She recognized it. It had come from the fraying cuff of the spare jacket she kept on the hook by the back door, the one she sometimes draped over the fence post when she was working outside. Someone had been in the yard. Someone had reached through the fence and taken Ren. Sage was already at the back door when Marin turned around. The dog's body was different from anything Marin had seen in the 4 days she had known her. Not the measured threat assessment vigilance of the first day. Not the careful provisional movements of early recovery. This was something that came from a place before any of that, something older and more absolute. The part of a living creature that existed before training and before damage and before any of the modifications that circumstances had imposed on it. Sage pressed her nose to the base of the door and made a sound that was not a bark and not a growl, and was not quite like anything Marin had a precise word for. It was the sound of a boundary that had been crossed. Marin opened the door. Sage moved into the darkness of the yard at a low, urgent pace, nose sweeping the ground in rapid, concentrated lines. She found the trail almost immediately. Marin could tell by the way the searching stopped and the movement became directional. She followed it to the fence gap, circled the exterior, pushed north along the fence line. Then she stopped. She raised her head and looked out across the dark field toward the road, toward the distance where whatever had happened was now beyond recoverable trace. And she made the sound again, different this time, lower, longer, the sound of something that knew the distance was wrong. Marin stood in the cold night and felt the helplessness of it settle in alongside the anger, which was a combination she recognized from previous professional contexts, but which felt different now, more personal, more present. Walter appeared at the edge of the yard in his coat and boots, because Walter was the kind of man who heard things and came without being called. She was taken, Marin said. He looked at the fence. He didn't ask who. Then he reached into his coat pocket and held out a piece of folded paper. "This was under the church door when I locked up tonight," he said. "I saw it when I came to check on you." She took it, unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, controlled, unhurried. 3 words and a clause. "Return the dog, the small one lives." No signature, no demand beyond that. No urgency in the language, which was itself a kind of violence. The confidence of a person who didn't need to hurry because they didn't doubt the outcome. Marin read it twice. Then she folded it once and put it in her jacket pocket with the steadiness of someone performing a deliberate act. She looked out across the field where Sage was still standing, still facing the dark road, still holding herself in that position of arrested movement, every muscle, engaged weight forward, all of her pointed at the absence of the thing she could not reach. Marin watched her for a long moment. She had been in situations before where the move available to her was not clean, where each option carried Trandon, and the question was not how to avoid damage, but how to manage its direction. She had made those calculations professionally under supervision, with protocols and oversight, and the institutional support of a chain of command. She was making this one alone, except not entirely alone. She looked at Sage still at the fence line. She looked back at the house at the warm rectangle of light from the window where Nova lay against the south wall, with her 2 thin puppies tucked against her, where Flint and Ash were asleep in the crate, where the space beside them held the outline of what was missing. She went back inside. She sat at the kitchen table with the note in front of her and a pen in her hand, in the particular cold clarity of someone who had stopped deciding whether to act and had begun deciding how. Morning came without softness. It arrived the way certain truths arrived, not announced, not gradual, but simply present, when you opened your eyes as if it had been waiting in the room all along and had only now decided to make itself known. The light through the east window was thin and white, the kind that gave nothing warmth and revealed everything clearly, and Marin was already at the table when it came because she had not slept. The note sat in front of her, unfolded now, the 3 lines of neat handwriting facing upward. She had spent the night doing what she had always done when the situation was genuinely serious, not planning in the conventional sense, not building elaborate sequences of contingency and counter-contingency, but simplifying, reducing the problem to its essential geometry. What did she have? What did she need? What was the shortest honest distance between those 2 points? What she had, a location she hadn't used yet, and a piece of information Vane didn't know she had. She had memorized the number from the truck panel on the first night. She had written it down and studied it and recognized its structure from her years of tracking supply chain documentation in CID cases. Not a serial number, not a vehicle identifier, but the kind of internal reference code that organizations use to track assets across multiple handlers without creating externally legible paper trails. If she could connect that number to a record, any record, it would give her something that Vane's layers of intermediary paperwork were specifically designed to prevent: a direct line. She had spent 4 hours of the night on her laptop moving through the kinds of databases that her former credentials still allowed partial access to, the kind of access that existed in a gray area between active service and civilian status that no one had formally closed. She had found 2 partial matches, one dead end. One that led her to a registered transport company in Cascade County that had filed fuel reimbursements against a route that passed through Millhaven on the same weekend as the market. The transport company's registered agent was a name she didn't recognize, but the secondary contact on the filing was Harwick Briggs. That was the thread. She called Deputy Seth Caulfield at 6:15 in the morning. She had met Caulfield twice, once when she had reported a fence breach in her first month in Millhaven that had turned out to be a neighbor's cattle, and once at the county hardware store where they had both been reaching for the same grade of weather stripping. He was in his early 40s, solid through the chest and shoulders in the way of men who worked physical jobs without making a performance of it, with a square jaw and light brown hair going gray at the temples and eyes that held a particular quality she associated with law enforcement people, who had been doing the work long enough to have lost their illusions about it without losing their commitment to it. He was, in her assessment, a man who understood the difference between what the law allowed and what the situation required, and who was honest enough with himself to know which was which on any given day. He arrived at 7. He came alone, which she took as its own kind of answer. He read the note. He set it on the table. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was sorting through several things simultaneously and doing it carefully. I can work with the transport company filing, he said. That gives me a legitimate hook for the Briggs connection, which gives me grounds to pull his recent activity, which may give me grounds for something broader. He paused. Maybe. What's the constraint? Vane's operation has documentation at every level I can reach officially. Ownership transfers, transport permits, breeding certifications. It's not clean, but it's layered in. Every time I get to a wall, there's a piece of paper on the other side of it that I have to spend time going around. He looked at the note again. What I can't do officially is move fast enough. I'm not asking you to do anything officially, Marin said. He looked at her for a moment. I know, he said. That's why I came alone. He told her what he knew from his own angle, which was more than she had expected. He had seen Vane's operations edges before in the form of transport vehicles that appeared on county roads at hours that suggested purpose without providing explanation, and in the form of two complaints over the past 18 months from local residents about dogs that had been present in their neighborhoods and then were not. Both complaints had stalled when the follow-up addresses resolved to registered businesses with clean paperwork. He had been building a file of his own quietly without institutional support because institutional support required the kind of case architecture that took time he hadn't had and evidence density he couldn't yet demonstrate. I have a route map, said Vesper Keene from the doorway. Marin turned. Caulfield turned. Vesper was standing on the porch, hand raised in a brief acknowledgement of her own unannounced arrival, with the composed expression of a person who was accustomed to showing up at inconvenient moments and had made a professional peace with the social friction that created. She was in her mid-30s, dark-haired, with a lean face and precise, watchful eyes, in the kind of stillness that came from years of learning to observe situations without altering them by her presence. Walter called me, she said, looking at Marin. He said you might need someone whose job it was to know where things moved without being supposed to. Marin looked at Walter, who was standing behind Vesper, with the expression of a man who had made a decision he considered both reasonable and outside his assigned role, and was prepared to account for it. Come in, Marin said. Vesper had been following the operational patterns of what she called closed-circuit animal networks for 7 months. She had started with a single tip from a veterinary technician in Gallatin County who had treated dogs that arrived with identification documentation inconsistent with their visible histories, chip registrations that didn't match age markers, vaccination records that referenced facilities she couldn't locate. She had mapped the movement patterns from that starting point outward using fuel receipt filings, transport permit applications, and the specific geography of which county roads received unexplained heavy vehicle traffic at specific times. She spread the printed map on the kitchen table. The route that passed through Millhaven was one of 4 she had identified. Each one converged at varying intervals on a cluster of waypoints in a roughly 40-mile radius east of the county line. The waypoints were not fixed facilities. They moved the way the market moved, setting up and dissolving before scrutiny could accumulate. But the routes themselves were fixed by geography. Roads were roads. The land didn't accommodate unlimited variation. There's a junction on the old logging access off Route 7, Vesper said, pointing. It appears in the movement pattern more consistently than any other single point. 3 of the 4 routes pass through it or within a mile of it. It's the only place where the timing windows align. Marin looked at the junction on the map. She knew the road. She had driven it in her first month as she had driven most of the secondary roads, filing them in the part of her mind that kept useful geography. When's the next window? She asked. Vesper checked her notes. Based on the pattern today, this afternoon, between 2 and 4 based on the previous interval spacing. Caulfield leaned over the map. I can get to that junction legally. I can't hold anyone there without probable cause, and I won't have time to build probable cause before the window. He straightened. But if I'm there and something happens to create observable evidence, I can act on what I observe. Marin nodded once. She looked at Sage. Sage was already standing. She had been standing since the conversation began, positioned near the table with her weight forward and her attention moving among the people in the room with a quality that Marin had stopped trying to categorize as animal attentiveness and had started recognizing as something more specific. Sage understood the room. She understood that something was being organized around the absence of Wren. Every shift in posture, every change in the tenor of the voices, every moment. When Marin's attention sharpened, Sage tracked all of it with the focused, patient attention of a being that was waiting for the moment when waiting ended and moving began. "You're staying here," Marin said. Sage looked at her with the amber eyes and did not move. "Nova needs you here," Marin said. "The others need you here." She wasn't sure why she explained it. Sage couldn't parse the words. But the explanation felt necessary not for Sage's understanding, but for her own honesty, because she was choosing to leave Sage behind, and she wanted the choice to be deliberate, not convenient. She drove the Route 7 junction with Caulfield following in his vehicle at a distance that suggested no relationship between them. Vesper remained further back, parked at the County Road intersection with a clear line of sight down the access road. Her job not to intervene, but to document license plates, timestamps, any visible evidence of the operation's mechanics that could support the case architecture. Caulfield needed to build something that would survive official scrutiny. The logging access road was narrow and deeply rutted from the previous week's freeze-thaw cycle. The tree cover on both sides was dense enough to limit sight lines, which was why it worked as a waypoint. You couldn't see what was there until you were in it, and by the time you were in it, whatever was there had already seen you. Marin parked 200 meters from the junction and walked the rest. She moved through the tree line without sound, using the techniques that had never fully left her, even in the 14 months of attempting to become a person who didn't need them. Her breathing slowed, her footfalls adjusted to the ground surface automatically. She kept low sight lines and moved with the stop-start patience of someone who understood that speed was almost never the variable that mattered most. The truck was already there. A different vehicle from any she had seen before, a dark panel van, newer with commercial plates from outside the state. Engine off. Two men visible in the front cab through the windshield, neither of them moving. Both of them watching the road in the way of people being paid to wait. She circled wide, came in from the back, and found what she was looking for. The rear doors of the van were not fully latched. A gap of 2 inches no more held by a rubber strap looped over the exterior handle, the kind of temporary arrangement that allowed ventilation without allowing exit. Through the gap, she could hear the specific composite sound of multiple contained animals, soft, irregular, the kind of restless breath that came from creatures in transit. She moved to the gap and eased the strap free. The door opened inward. Stacked plastic containers, precisely as Vesper's route documentation had suggested the transport method of choice for for a system that needed to move living things efficiently and invisibly. 4 containers sealed with ventilation holes cut in clean rows across the lids. She moved the nearest one aside, then the second. In the third container, smaller than the others, curled in the tight C shape of a creature that had decided to make itself as small as possible in the available space, was Wren. The puppy's eyes were open, but unfocused in the way of something that had been frightened past the point where fear had a specific shape and had settled into a generalized, exhausted endurance. Its breathing was shallow. Its body was drawn in on itself, every surface pulled toward the center, the posture of something trying to occupy as little of a hostile world as possible. Marin knelt in the open door of the van. She placed her hand near the ventilation holes of the container and waited. 3 seconds. 4. Wren's nose moved, a small, uncertain twitch. Then the puppy shifted, not much, just enough, and pressed its nose against the plastic surface nearest to Marin's hand. Marin opened the container. She reached in slowly, kept her hands visible, kept her body angled to reduce perceived threat. She let Wren come to the decision. The puppy trembled. She could feel it through her palms when she finally made contact. But it moved toward her rather than away, the way it had moved toward her in the very first moments in the pen at the market, with the same quality of reluctant, necessary faith. She lifted it and held it against her chest and stood. Behind her, she heard the front doors of the van open. She stepped out of the rear of the van and turned, and the 2 men from the cab were standing 15 feet away, and the calculation in both their expressions was the specific calculation of people who had been trained to manage situations but had not been given specific instructions for this particular situation. Then Seth Caulfield walked out of the tree line to her left, his badge in one hand and his phone in the other, his voice carrying the measured authority of a man who had been waiting for observable evidence and had just observed it. "Caulfield Sheriff's Department," he said. "I need both of you to stay where you are." The men stayed where they were. Marin walked past them toward the road Wren held against her chest. the puppies trembling, beginning to slow by degrees with each step she took away from the van. She was at the edge of the tree line when she heard something behind her. Not from the van, from the trees. She turned. Sage stood at the junction where the logging road met the access track 20 feet away, her sides heaving, her paws dark with the mud of the lower fields. Her coat was marked with the evidence of distance, covered at speed burrs, along the flanks, dirt along the nose. She had crossed the backfield, found the road and followed it, and she was standing now with the particular expression of a creature that had finished an enormous effort and had not yet allowed itself to acknowledge that the effort was over. She had not been commanded. She had not been taken. She had decided. Marin stood still. Sage looked at Wren, then she looked at Marin. Her body was still heaving from the run, each breath visible in the cold air, and she held herself in that position of exhausted, committed presence, all of her aimed forward, none of her retreating. Marin took 2 steps toward her. Sage moved forward at the same moment, not to the puppy, not to Wren, who was right there, who was the thing she had tracked across a frozen field to find, but to Marin's hand. She pressed her nose against the back of Marin's knuckles and held it there, steady, unambiguous. Not asking, not testing. Not the careful provisional contact of an animal extending the minimum possible trust while keeping retreat available. Something complete. Something that had decided. Marin stood in the cold with Wren against her chest and Sage's nose against her hand, and she felt something that she had not felt in a very long time. Something she had not had a name for since the incident that ended her career. Something that existed in the space between being needed and being chosen. She did not move for a long moment because she understood with the clear-eyed precision of someone who had spent years studying the mechanics of how trust was broken exactly what she was being offered. Then she heard the vehicle. Conrad Vane's SUV appeared at the far end of the access road, moving at the same measured pace she had come to associate with him, unhurried, controlled, deliberate. It stopped 30 feet away. He got out alone, which told her something about his confidence, and stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the scene in front of him, with the expression of a man adjusting his assessment in real time. His gaze moved from the van to the 2 men now standing with a Caulfield, to Marin, to Wren, to Sage. It stopped on Sage for a moment. Then he looked at Marin. "This doesn't resolve anything," he said. His voice was even conversational, as if they were resuming a discussion, rather than standing at the end of one. "One seizure, one incident, these are administrative inconveniences. The filing structure holds. The documentation holds. You have disrupted a single node." He took 2 steps closer. "I want you to understand something clearly. This organization exists across more jurisdictions than this one county. It has operated for longer than you have lived in Montana. Individual actors are contained and replaceable. Individual incidents are absorbed." He paused. "I respect what you've done here. I mean that without condescension. But you are confusing the branch for the tree." Marin looked at him steadily. She had thought about what she would say to him if she had the chance to say it in the hours of the night when she was not sleeping and the note was on the table in front of her. She had composed and discarded several versions, some precise, some pointed, some that expressed the full weight of her contempt for what she had seen in that emptied building, with its systematic drag marks and its frayed nylon restraints and its absent records. What she said was simple. "Then we'll start with the branch." Vane held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Sage one more time, with a particular expression of a man saying goodbye to something he had planned around for a long time, and something in the expression was not quite as controlled as the rest of him. Not grief. Closer to the specific frustration of a precise person confronting a variable that had refused to behave according to the system designed to contain it. He turned and walked back to his vehicle. Seth Caulfield was already on the phone when Vane's SUV reached the end of the access road, his voice steady and factual, and carrying the weight of a man filing something that was going to matter. Vesper was at the junction with her camera and her notebook in the 7 months of documentation that would form the architecture of an account that would be read by people far outside Millhaven. Marin drove home. Wren slept against her leg in the passenger seat within 4 minutes. Sage sat in the back, and at some point during the drive, she rested her chin on the top of the front seat and remained there near Marin's shoulder, not demanding anything, not asking for anything, just present. The house was as she had left it. Walter's truck was parked outside. She could see through the window that he was in his chair and the light was on, and the room was warm. She carried Wren inside and set the puppy gently in the center of the space where the others were sleeping, and before she had finished standing back up, Flint and Ash had moved to press against their small sibling with the automatic instinctive warmth of creatures that understood reunion at a level that preceded language. Nova lifted her head. She looked at Wren. Then she looked at Sage, who had come through the door behind Marin and now stood in the center of the room, and the look between the two adult dogs carried something that Marin had no precise vocabulary for: a mutual recognition, a shared and unremarked understanding of what the room meant and what had been required to make it mean that. Walter handed her a cup of coffee and said nothing, because he was a man who understood that some moments did not need words added to them. She drank the coffee and stood near the wall and watched the room settle. Spring did not come quickly to that part of Montana. It arrived by concession: a degree of temperature here, an hour of additional light there, the frost loosening its grip on the road ruts in increments so gradual that you could miss the change entirely if you weren't paying close attention. But it came. It always came. Sage's coat came back first. The black across her back deepened. The tan at her chest and legs returned to the warmth it was supposed to carry. Her ribs ceased to imply themselves. She moved through the yard with a different quality, entirely not the measured exit-noting movement of the first days, not even the carefully provisional ease of the middle weeks, but the unguarded, fully inhabited movement of an animal that had decided the ground it stood on was reliable. Nova came back more slowly. She had further to come, but she came. The yard, once Marin extended the fence line and repaired the gate with materials she had finally bought, for the right reason, rather than the practical one, became a place that produced an amount of noise she had not anticipated. Wren ran with a reckless, uncalculated speed that seemed to have no destination other than the general concept of forward. Flint disputed everything. Ash watched from a position of studied neutrality and, occasionally without apparent provocation, joined whatever chaos was in progress with the commitment of a creature that had been waiting for the right moment. Caulfield's case moved slowly, which was how official cases moved, but it moved. The transport company filing connected to Briggs connected to two other intermediaries. The intermediaries connected to documentation that Vesper's 7 months of route mapping gave context to. Conrad Vane was not arrested. The structure he had built was designed to ensure that no individual action could be pinned to him directly, and that design was good enough to hold for now. But the case was open. The record existed. The documentation that had been deliberately absent now had a shadow, and shadows were what official processes worked from, and official processes were slow and imperfect and necessary. Vesper's account ran in a regional publication first and then in two others. It did not use inflammatory language. It did not overstate what the evidence showed. It laid out in careful, specific detail the mechanics of what had been operating across 4 counties, the movement patterns, the documentation gaps, the animals that had appeared and disappeared in ways the official record could not account for. It named what could be named and attributed accurately what could be attributed. It did not change the system overnight. It changed how the system could be seen. That was different, and it mattered. Walter came by most evenings. He had stopped bringing things as a pretext. He had simply begun arriving, and Marin had stopped requiring a reason because she had recognized somewhere in the middle weeks that Walter's arrivals were not an imposition, but a form of company she had apparently been in need of without having acknowledged the need. He sat in his chair. He drank his coffee. He watched the boys with the expression of a man for whom the evidence of recovery in a living creature was one of the more reliable consolations available in a complicated world. One evening in late March, when the light was staying past 6 for the first time, and the yard was loud with the specific productive chaos of 5 dogs deciding the best use of an evening, Marin stood at the gate and looked at the piece of wood she had been carrying in the truck bed for 3 weeks without knowing what she was waiting for. She knew now. She found her tools and worked in the fading light, and Walter held the flashlight when the light failed entirely, and she didn't rush because she had learned over the preceding months that the things worth doing were generally the things worth doing at the right pace rather than the fastest one. She secured the board to the gatepost with 4 screws level solid. The letters she had carved into it were not decorative. They were not elaborated. They were simply clear. No soul is worthless just because someone priced it wrong. Walter stood beside her and read it without speaking for a long moment. "You chose those words carefully," he said. I didn't choose them, Marin said. They were already there. He made a small sound of agreement, the sound of a man who recognized a truth when he encountered one, and had the grace not to require more explanation than that. Behind them, the yard moved with the sounds of the evening. Nova walked the fence line, slowly pausing to take in things at ground level, with the growing curiosity of an animal relearning that the world held things worth attending to. Flint tried to convince Ash that the old boot near the shed was a legitimate priority. Ash declined. Wren ran in the long swooping circuit that had become the standard evening warm-up. No destination, no quarry, just the full and unambiguous use of legs that worked and ground that held. And Sage. Sage stood in the center of the yard in the last angle of light that the sun sent across the flats before dropping fully behind the ridge. She was looking at nothing in particular and everything in general, the yard, the fields beyond the fence, the house, the gate with its new board. She turned her head and found Marin at the gate, and the amber eyes that had been dim and receded when Marin first saw them in the pen at the market held their light now without effort. Her tail moved. Not once. Not in the small, reflexive flicker of the early weeks, the almost motion of a creature that had learned to distrust its own impulses. It moved fully and freely from the root to the tip, a complete and unhesitating expression of exactly what it was. Not a signal designed for an audience, not a performance of recovered health, but simply the outward evidence of an internal state that had no reason left to hide itself. Marin looked at her and did not look away. She had spent a long time looking away from things that moved her. She had developed considerable skill at the peripheral acknowledgement, the managed glance, the practiced redirection of attention that kept feeling at a functional distance. It had served her in certain contexts. It had cost her in others. She understood both of those things clearly now. She let herself see it, all of it. The dog standing in the last light of a March evening in a yard that had been empty 4 months ago, her coat deep and full, her body occupied by itself without apology, her tail moving with the uncalculated freedom of something that had found its way back to itself by a route neither of them had chosen, and both of them had taken anyway. Outside Millhaven, the world continued as worlds did, imperfectly, incompletely, with systems that did not collapse because a single case had been opened or a single article had been published. Vane was somewhere doing the work of someone whose system had absorbed a disruption and was adjusting. The routes existed. The documentation layering existed. The patience of people who depended on silence existed. But here in this particular corner of a cold northern state, something had been interrupted. Something had been refused. Two beings that a system had evaluated and found insufficient had found each other and found themselves, and that finding had cost both of them considerably and had given both of them something that could not be priced, because it was not the kind of thing that existed in the language of price. The light faded, the yard filled with the ordinary sounds of ordinary evening, the dog settling Walter's chair, scraping slightly on the porch boards as he stood to go the fence, holding what it was meant to hold. Marin stayed at the gate until the last of the light was gone. Then she went inside and the house was warm, and she left the gate light on.